Okay, good afternoon. We're going to go ahead and start now taking a look at the bones section. And we're going to start with the skull. And I'll go through the parts of the skull here. What I'd like to do with bones is to spend enough time on this so you have 3 or 4 weeks to get ready for your bone test. There's a lot of information to learn, and it's always the easiest way to do well in this on the bone test is to try and learn a little bit every night. There's 206 bones in the human body and lots of openings and bumps and ridges and grooves and things like that. And this isn't to scare anybody, because students usually do really well on the bone test. Surprisingly better than they surprise themselves by doing really well on it, particularly if they were disappointed with their first test grade. So that's why I want to give you as much time as possible to get ready for this. Material in the bone section here is something that's relevant, something that you'll be able to use again and again and again, particularly as you go into more advanced classes and go into your careers too. So I will make sure we spend a lot of time on this. Now, lab test. Lab test 1 is going to open up next week. And since the Monday lab is behind the curve because we had the holiday at the beginning of the semester, so we're a week behind the other class, the other lab. Since this is a virtual class, it really doesn't mean a whole lot. And what I would like to do is open up the test for you next Monday. I'll open it up at 12:01 Monday morning. And I was considering leaving it open for 48 hours. So you can take it any time in that 48-hour period that you want. What I'd like to do is then move on and continue on with bones during the regular class time. So on next Monday. So you wouldn't have to, you don't have to take the test, the lab test, at the regular class time. You can take it anytime in the 48-hour time frame, whatever is going to be convenient for you all. So, I mean, that gives you even gives you an extra day to get ready for it. If you don't want to take it till Tuesday, that's fine. And if something happens that you can't do it in that 48-hour window, it's not the end of the world. Just let me know, and I can extend yours. If you have any questions about this test, let me know. I'll be more than happy to try and answer that for you. In the meantime, let's go ahead and get into bones of the body. Okay, now. Okay, so we're going to start with the skull. There are, as I said, there are 206 bones in the body. This little illustration is what passes for humor in the natural science division, but it's a nice way to remember what some of the bones are too. And the good thing about the human body, oops, let me get carried away with myself. The good thing about the body is that what you have in the left side of the body is going to be the same as the right side. The bones of the arms are the same on either side, the same with the bones of the legs, bones of the hands and feet, and the pelvis and the neck. They're all going to be the same bones. The skull is somewhat similar in that manner. The large bones of the skull are named for the lobes of the brain, which are directly underneath. And so those are consistent. So we pretty much keep the same patterns right here. It's only in the skull that we have some unusual names and shapes. So we'll go through that. Of the 206 bones, there are 22 bones in the skull. Now don't forget, in addition to the 206 bones, we also have about 200 or so openings and ridges and bumps and structures that we call processes. That's another name for a bump. And fossas. A fossa is another name for a flat area. So we have these to throw in there too. So altogether, there's about 400 or 500 pieces of information that you'll need to remember for this test. And if you want a complete list of all the bones, I should have a complete list for you in this section in eLearn. And also, if you go to the lab guide, which you find in the table of contents in eLearn for this class, it will also list all the bones and all the processes and openings and bumps and ridges and grooves too. So, and that's the only study guide you're going to need to go with this, is to learn the names of the bones that I talk about in lab, that I talk about, to learn those and be able to identify those for this for lab test 2. So, okay, now we're looking at the skull today. This is a nice 360-degree X-ray of the skull. You've seen something like this in the past. You probably had the full view X-ray of your teeth when you went into your dentist's office. What I find interesting here is there's something going on in the skull right here. There's a dark spot on the left side of the skull that is not usual. I don't know what it is, but so we're seeing not just the panoramic or 360-degree image of our teeth. This is a full 360-degree image of the skull and the vertebrae and of the cervical vertebrae, and even some of the thoracic vertebrae, parts of the ribs and parts of the collarbone too. But there's something going on here. There's a dark spot that's not supposed to be there on the skull. So, okay, so let's take a look at the skull itself. The first bone that we see is the frontal bone. This is the bone that nobody ever gets wrong on the bone test. The frontal bone is in the front of the skull. It is covered by a very thin layer of skin and muscle. And we use those muscles there primarily to show expression. And we'll talk about those when we get into the muscle section, but we don't do a whole lot of movement of the bone, of the frontal bone. But the frontal bone covers the front of the skull from about the midline down to right above the nose, and usually the top portion of the eyeball orbit, the eye orbit. That's what we call the socket where the eyeballs go in. And you can see just how large a bone it is here. It gives the characteristic shape of the front of our face. And you can see on the transparent animation just how large a bone it is. But then it comes down to right above the top of the nasal bone and forms the top portion, the anterior portion or superior portion of the eye orbit itself. So now looking at our skull model that I'll show you the one I have here also, we can see there's our eye orbit right there. The eye orbit is where our eyeballs are found. We can tell a lot about just looking at eyeballs. When we get into AP2, you'll see that perhaps in some cases, some pathological conditions, the eyeballs bulge out. And that's indicative of that's a very strong symptom of a certain characteristic condition. So just a lot of times appearance is everything here, and as far as how an individual looks. I mean, we've often been told, well, you look tired, or you look like you're run down, or you're worn out, or whatever, or you're getting sick. Well, a lot of times we can tell things like that just by appearance. So anyway, there's the eye orbit. Now, directly above the eye orbit is a notch, like a little groove in the surface of the orbit. And that's called there we go. It's called the supraorbital notch. Supra means above. So it's a notch above the orbit of the eye. And its counterpart, if we have in anatomy, if we have a supra or superior, we're always going to have an infra or inferior. And here we have an infraorbital foramen. That's that little hole right there that the arrow is off track. Let me see if I can. The infraorbital foramen is this structure right there, and the notch is actually there. So the infraorbital foramen is a hole. Now, the word foramen, it means opening. I don't know why we can't say hole or opening, but the term is foramen. And so we use foramen mostly for openings in the bones. And these openings in the bones are going to be always for the passage of a nerve or a nerve and a blood vessel. So we refer to them as foramens. Now that supraorbital notch doesn't show up real well on this particular model, but let me let me clear this off, get out of here, stop sharing, go to the other camera, and we can see, come on, open up. Oh, see this, looking at with the other camera, we can see, let's see if I can get that too. Okay. Well, not going to work. So, but there, that little mark right there that you can see, barely see in that picture, is the supraorbital notch. Let me get back out of this and go to. Now let's get back to share screen. Okay, supraorbital notch. It's a little ridge, a little groove, if you will, in the area above the eyeball orbit. Okay. The infraorbital foramen is the opening below the orbit. Whenever we have a groove like that, it's always for the passageway of a nerve or a blood vessel or both. The same applies to the foramen. The foramen is always the passageway of a nerve or a blood vessel or both. And we'll see some very large foramens here as we go through the skull. Okay, now, this bone right here, this bone that you see that the arrow is pointing at is called the ethmoid bone. And right behind the, see, this is the, hang on one second, let me fix this because it's bothering me. Okay, I'm going to just do it the way it is, even though it's wrong. Okay. Optic Foramen. There's what I'm looking for. Ethmoid bone. There. Okay. Now I'm happy, such as it is. Okay. Now, sorry about that. Now it's lined up. Infraorbital foramen. The optic foramen is right there. Now, the optic foramen is a passage for a nerve that we've probably all heard of. It's called the optic nerve. The optic nerve leaves the back of the eyeball and goes through that opening into the through the bones of the skull and directly into the brain. So it passes through that particular opening there, and we'll see it when we look at the inside of the skull. We'll see the other end of the optic foramen. This bone is called the ethmoid bone, and the ethmoid bone is actually not just that little itty bitty bone there, but it shows up on the other side in the other eye orbit, and it actually extends not just from here across like that, it also extends down into the nasal cavity and up into the base of the skull in here. So it's a very large bone. It makes up the inner wall. The ethmoid bone makes up the inner wall of on the medial side, the innermost wall on the medial side, closest to the midline of the orbit, but it also extends up into the base of the skull where the brain sits, and extends down into the nasal cavity. Half of that divider that divides the nasal cavity into two segments is part of the ethmoid bone. It plays a major role in the passage of the olfactory nerves, the nerves that allow us to detect odors. It also plays a major role in keeping the brain from sloshing around inside the skull. So it is more than just this little itty bitty bone right here. Frontal bone. Well, we got that one. Everybody knows the frontal bone. The frontal bone is the bone in the front of our skull, and nobody ever gets that wrong in a test. It's also named for the frontal lobes of the brain, which sit directly underneath the frontal bone. So we have the paired frontal lobes underneath the frontal bone. Behind that, on either side of the frontal bone and the back of it, are the parietal bones. The parietal bones cover the top part of the skull and extend down the side about halfway. They're named for the parietal lobes of the brain, left and right parietal lobes. So we have the frontal lobe and the parietal lobes. We have now between right at the edge of the frontal bone and the parietal bone is a bone called the sphenoid. And it's another one that would make you think it's just a small bone, but the sphenoid bone actually extends from here on the side all the way across to the other side, and it forms and extends out there. It also then extends underneath all this inside and forms the base of the cranial cavity that the brain sits on. So again, it's another one of those very large bones that look like nothing because all we're seeing is the outside edge of it here, but it extends all the way across, and the bottom portion of the brain rests on top of the sphenoid bone inside the cranial cavity. See that here as we go along. That's the sphenoid bone. Now here is the temporal bone. The temporal bone is located on either side of our head, named for the temporal lobes underneath. If you can find your ears, you found the temporal bone. You stick your fingers into your ears, then you are at the opening of the auditory canal that leads directly into the brain. The auditory canal leads into a groove, into a channel through the bone that comes out into the brain, and you have the auditory nerve going through there. And if you can find where your ears are, you've found your temporal bone. One on either side, temporal lobe is directly underneath that. This is the zygomatic bone. The zygomatic bone is essentially our cheekbone. If you go to the eye orbit and go to that large prominent bone that bulges out at the base of the eye of the orbit on the side and trace it back, that's the zygomatic bone. We call that our cheekbone. And it again gives shape to our face and to our skull. The upper jaw, the immobile portion of our jaw, is the maxilla. The upper jaw doesn't move. When we chew by pulling the mandible, the lower jaw, this is the mandible right there, up against it. So we chew by crushing food with our teeth against the teeth of the maxilla. So we have a series of muscles we'll see in Unit 3 we have several very powerful sets of muscles that are designed to pull the mandible up against the maxilla to crush and grind and rip and tear the food that we're chewing. You know, our teeth are designed to be crushers and grinders to cut. The incisors are designed for cutting, and the canines are for ripping and tearing. And so all this is taking place because we're pulling the mandible up against the maxilla. So that's our mandible and our maxilla. They make up our upper and lower jaw. Remember, the maxilla doesn't move, only the mandible moves. Now, in the middle of our mandible is called a structure called the mandibular symphysis. A symphysis is where two bones come together. Now, in this case, they grew together when we were in utero, laying down our skeleton. There are other symphyses in our bodies where we have a pad of cartilage in between, in between two bones. But in this case, this is where two bones have come together, and in the case of the mandible, have fused into one large bone. So other areas where we're going to have a gap in there with a pad of cartilage in between there. So this is called the mandibular symphysis. Continuing along the term mandible, we have the mandibular angle, where the mandible, the lower jaw, has to bend to go up so that the end of the mandible can articulate against the skull itself. Bones articulate when two bones come together and move against each other. You know, the bones of our fingers articulate against the bones on either side of it. You know, the bones at the end of our fingers articulate with the next bone up, and the bone in the middle articulates with the bone on either side of it. It's where bones move with other bones. That's articulation. And to get the end of the mandible to come up to the base of the skull to articulate, we have to bend it. It has to come up, and that bend is the mandibular angle. In this region here, and this is the only time you're going to hear this word, it's called ramus. It's when this is where we've gone past the angle, and now it's going straight up towards the base of the skull. Okay, this is our mandible right here. Here we see the lower jaw. It articulates these the end of the mandible here and here are going to fit into a depression inside at the base of the skull, and that's going to allow them to articulate and to move around, to be able to be pulled back and forth or up and down by our muscles. Okay. So that's everything. You know, that was a list of most of the bones that we see looking at the front of the skull. Looking at the side here, we can see the temporal bone highlighted in blue. You can see the auditory canal is right here. And we see that there's the frontal bone up here. There's the parietal bone. You know, here's frontal. Here's parietal right there. Here's the temporal. Here is the auditory canal right there, the auditory opening. So again, if you use your ear as a reference, that is the location of the temporal bone. Now we also see a little pointy shaped structure right here, and that is called a styloid process. Now, a styloid process, and we have them in at least 3 locations in our bodies, in our skull and in our arms. Styloid processes are just pointy structures. They're called a stylus because ancient writing tools were called a stylus. You know, if you go back hundreds and hundreds of years, and writing was done on soft clay tablets with a sharp pointed object, like maybe a sharpened stick or something, or maybe something made out of bronze or gold or whatever. And you could write into the clay and you could be precise, and the clay would harden and you'd have a tablet with information on it. the writing object was called a stylus. You know, that term has lasted for hundreds and hundreds of years. And now we're back to writing on tablets. When you write on your iPad with a stylus, you're making a mark on you know, you're using the pen that came with your iPad called a stylus, and you're writing on a tablet again. So, you know, everything comes, you know, everything circles around eventually. Anyway, the point is that pointy objects, pointy shaped bones in our skull and in our arms are called styloid processes, because early anatomists were comparing it to writing implements. That's why they got called styloid. They were called styloid for stylus. Now, okay. Let's take a look at, now looking at our skull, you know, we can see, this is, you know, from the perspective of, we're looking at the, this is looking at the right side of the skull, looking at the lateral surface, the outside surface. And of course, first thing we see are these wiggly lines up here at the top. These wiggly lines are called suture lines, and suture lines are another type of junction of bones. Now, when bones articulate, they come together because they're going to move. You know, that's what the articulation means. Articulation means to move around. Sutures are a type of junction of bones that don't move. The suture lines in our skull, even though the bones have come together, those bones are fused now. They're stuck together and they're not going to move. And so these suture lines have formed over time. It takes our suture lines about 20 years to finally immobilize, because our skull has got a lot of give to it as we grow over time. You know, we're going to see the model of the fetal skull, and we're going to see these big soft spots in here that allow for expansion. The suture is the remnant of those expansions. The suture line is just where bones have come together. And we call this the coronal suture, because it is a coronal cut, if you will. It divides the skull into the front and the back, or the anterior and the posterior regions. So this is the coronal suture line. We also have there's our frontal bone, there is our parietal bone, there's our temporal bone, there's our zygomatic bone, our cheekbone again. New bone, the occipital bone. The occipital bone is in the base of our skull. It's from about halfway back around the side at the posterior end of the skull and goes all the way across the base of the skull and butts up against the sphenoid bone. This is the occipital bone. It protects the occipital lobe. The occipital lobes are arguably one of the most important areas of our brain, because that's where we process vision, in our occipital lobes. And so they are more protected than other parts of the skull. They're deep down inside the brain, at the base, at the back of the brain, and they're protected by these two, you know, the bones here are very strong. So we have the occipital bone. There's a suture line there separating parietal bones from the temporal bones. We call it the squamous suture. And we have another suture line here, which we call the lambdoid suture. As adults, I mean, this represents an adult skull. These suture lines are all immobilized. But up until about age 20, 25, somewhere in that time frame, our suture lines were not completely immobilized yet. We still had a little bit of give as we were finalizing our makeup of our skeleton, because we don't have a complete skeleton in place until we're about 25 years old. Yeah. Nasal bone. First, the first portion of our nose is bone. The portion where our nostrils are located is all cartilage. So the upper portion of our nose is bone. It's the nasal bone, and our actual nasal structure would continue You know, our nose actually continues out a little further here. Probably a little further, there we go, more like that. Because the nostrils are located down here, but we have bone here, and the rest of this area in between is, you know, hyaline cartilage. It's soft, it's flexible. You can take the tip of your nose and bend it around. You know, it's designed to be very soft and flexible. The upper portion that helps give it its shape is bone, but the rest of that is cartilage, and it's all, you know, as we like to say, soft tissue. So now this structure here is called the mastoid process. If you stick your finger behind your ear, you can feel a bump right behind your ear, about halfway down the back of your ear. Behind your ear, you'll feel a bump on either side, and that's called the mastoid process. Now, the mastoid process is important for two ways. One, it's the site of attachment of some very powerful muscles that we use to turn our head left and right. You know, we'll talk about that when we get into muscles. So they're very strong muscles attached to the mastoid process. The other thing about the mastoid process is the bone there is honeycombed. It's like a sponge. And that is an alternate passageway for sound. Sound comes in through our ear canal. The pressure waves that cause sounds come in through our ear canal, but they also come in through our bone. In fact, if I put my fingers over my mastoid processes right now, I sound to myself, I sound slightly different than I do when I take my fingers away. And when we get into later on, and we talk about the nervous system, one of the tests that we do in class, and I'll demonstrate this for you when we get there, is to take a tuning fork and strike the tuning fork and place the end of the tuning fork up against the mastoid process, and you will hear the sound of the note the tuning fork is generating, whether it's C or a D or B, whatever musical note the tuning fork is generating. And you place the end of the fork, the handle end of it, up against the bone, and you'll be able to hear that sound through the bone. And assuming that there's no issues with any kind of conduction problem, you'll hear it just fine. Now, to test and see if there is a conduction issue, if you hold the tuning fork against the bone until the sound goes away, and then take the fork and hold the tongs of the fork, the upright portion, against your external ear, you should still hear the sound. Because the mastoid process isn't as sensitive as our ear is. So what we're demonstrating is that sound waves can come through the auditory canal and be picked up by the inner ear from either the mastoid process or outside. And if you hear it from one and not the other, then it may be an indicator of some sort of conduction problem. Anyway, we'll get into all of that when we get into the nervous system portion of lab in probably April. But the mastoid process is often where cochlear implants are placed. Cochlear implants are, an electronic device that will collect sound waves and route it directly to the inner ear, bypassing a problem with the tympanic membrane, the eardrum, or the bones of the middle ear, any kind of conduction issue. So the mastoid process is a very important structure for both sound and for movement. Okay, and there's our styloid process again. Styloid processes are simply points of attachment for muscles. Despite everything they're sort of interesting because we have these sharp, pointy little bones. All they are places of attachment for muscles. A process is a bump, a ridge, an extension, something. Early anatomists, if they couldn't come up with any other name for a bone or a structure on a bone, they called it a process. So that's the styloid process. The mastoid process is another type of bump or ridge or raised projection. There's our ethmoid bone again. Here you can see it because it does show up on both sides of the orbit. And you can see it here, it highlighted in green as it goes around on the skull here. That's the ethmoid bone. Directly in front of the ethmoid bone is another bone called the lacrimal bone. And the lacrimal bone gives rise to the opening for a gland called the lacrimal gland. And the lacrimal gland is what secretes tears to wash off our eyeballs with. So whenever time we blink, we are cleaning our eyeballs because of all the dust and dirt and debris that lands on them. So we're constantly washing them with lacrimal fluid, tears, if you will. Now this little opening here is a foramen. There's one on each side of the mandible in the front. And you would think it was called the mandibular foramen. It seems to make sense. It's in the mandible, right? Well, it's called the mental foramen. For some reason, early anatomists decided to call that the mental form of the mandible. And so that's called the mental foramen. There is a mandibular foramen. There's one on each side of the mandible, but it's on the inside surface of the mandible. Again, these foramens are going to be the passageways for blood vessels and nerves. Because remember, bones are living tissue. The bone cells trapped in the bony matrix have to be fed with nutrients and supplied with oxygen, have our waste products removed. And so we have to have these passageways to get nutrients and oxygen to the living bone cells and take away the waste products and keep them supplied with information through the various nerves. There's our occipital bone. This is, I was pointing out that it is a very large bone. It comes from about halfway back on the skull and extends all the way forward to where it butts up against the sphenoid bone. There's a very large opening in it called the Foramen Magnum, which means big opening. And that's where the spinal cord comes through into the brain. And the spinal cord then joins the brainstem somewhere just inside of this opening. This is the largest foramen in the whole body. So, and let's see. Okay, now there's the occipital bone. It gives shape to the skull. It protects the occipital lobes and allows the spinal cord to join with the medulla oblongata at the brainstem. And this is, we call this opening the Foramen Magnum, the large opening or big hole, if you will. The opening there is big enough for the spinal cord to come through. At that point, the spinal cord is about the size, the thickness of your thumb as it goes through that opening. Now, the mandibular foramen, mandibular foramens, that's what these holes are here. These are the mandibular foramens. They are the inside surface of the mandibles. The mental foramens are on the outside, but these are the mandibular foramen. So again, passages for blood vessels and nerves. Okay, now, suture lines again, I made this point earlier. All they are is a joint where the bones have come together. The bones are not going to articulate. They are going to be a rigid joint that doesn't move because the bones have grown into each other. But again, it takes about 20 years after birth before this can happen. Our bone, we don't get our final adult skeleton until we're about 23 years of age. Anyway, and there are 17 sutures in the skull. We're only going to look at the coronal, the only ones we look at, pay attention to the most are the coronal and the sagittal and the lambdoid, for example, and the sphenoidal. And there are the sutures of the skull, looking at it from the top down, with the most important ones on here. There's the frontal bone. There are the two parietal bones. There's the occipital bone. There is the coronal suture, separating the frontal bone from the two parietal bones. There is the sagittal suture, giving us a left and right, a sagittal cut, a sagittal plane divides the structure into a left and right side. Well, the sagittal suture runs right down the middle, right on top, excuse me, of the longitudinal fissure of the two halves of the brain. Of course, we have the squamous suture and the lambdoid suture. There's the lambdoid suture, and you can't see the squamous suture, but the squamous suture separates the temporal from the parietal bone. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Now I've been talking a lot about the sphenoid bone and the ethmoid bone. Let me take some time now and explain what they do for us. The sphenoid and ethmoid bones are part of the cranium. They protect the underside, the underneath surface of the brain. The sphenoid bone is shaped like a bat. It is the bat wing shaped bone, and we call it the keystone bone. This is the sphenoid bone right here. There we go. This is the sphenoid bone. This is the ethmoid bone here. This thing right here is the ethmoid. Remember, I said it did stick up into the cranial cavity, but the rest of this is all sphenoid in here. And it's, we just see the outer, looking at it from the outside, we just see the outer surface, a small outer surface regions here and over here, but the bone itself is very large. And see how it butts up. Let me clear my drawing. We can see how it butts up against this is the occipital bone here. And so the sphenoid bone forms part of the base of the skull, because this is the occipital and this is sphenoid, and they butt together right along in here. Okay, there's your sphenoid bone. It's a large bone. It extends from side to side. You can see the side regions there that are visible from the outside, but the rest of it we don't see. It extends down to the upper jaw, to the maxilla. It extends backwards to the occipital bone. Now that area highlighted in green is called the lesser wing of the sphenoid, and the area in white is the greater wing of the sphenoid. Those are landmarks for us. If we look now, we're looking directly into the skull, directly down on the sphenoid bone. And this area here is the lesser wing of the sphenoid. And it is highlighted, and you saw it on the animation, but this is the lesser wing of the sphenoid here and here, like this. The greater wing of the sphenoid is this area here. And the region that you see on the outside is right along in there and underneath that letter. So that's the lesser wing of the sphenoid. The greater wing of the sphenoid is this region there. Now, before I get to that structure, the other area of the sphenoid, there we go, is called the Cela Turcica. So you have the lesser wing of the sphenoid, the small bat wing shaped structure, the greater wing, the whole thing basically resembles a bat. And then in the middle of the sphenoid, you have a structure called the Cela Turcica. And the Cela Turcica is Latin for Turk's saddle, because when you view this structure from the side, it resembles a saddle. And this is the location of the pituitary gland. The master gland of our body is suspended inside the Cela Turcica, protected there, because this is the, arguably the most important gland, because it releases in our body, because it releases 8 different hormones out of our brain. And so we find that the pituitary gland protected inside the Cela Turcica. So now these other structures here, two very key foramens, the Foramen Magnum, the largest opening in the body, in the bone. That's the opening for the spinal cord to come through. And it's about, the spinal cord at that point is about the size of your thumb. And then on either side of the Foramen Magnum, you have the jugular foramens. The jugular foramens are the openings for the jugular veins that are returning back towards the heart, coming back from draining the area of the brain and the rest of the head. And so these are very large veins, and these are very large foramens here that these veins pass through. Now, something else we see here are 4 openings. We have 4 openings here for the passage of what we call cranial nerves going into and out of the brain. The 2 outer openings are called the foramen ovalis, and the 2 inner openings are called the foramen lacerum. And they follow that sequence. It's, you know, come on, here we go. Okay. You want to remember the order of this. It's always O, L, L, O. Foramen ovalis on the outside. Think outside, ovale. The foramen lacerums are on the inside. Can't think of an easy way to remember that, but ovalis are on the outside, lacerums are on the inside. It goes O, L, L, O. Yeah. And so we can tell a couple things here by the fact that they are the same structures on both sides, meaning that they are supplying nerves to and from the brain on both sides. Because remember, the brain, controls, the left side of the brain controls the right side of the body, and the right side of the brain controls the left side of the body. And so we have these nerves coming up and going out on the same named structures on both sides, probably going to the same lobes of the brain on the left and right side. So O, L, L, O. So we see 2 foramen ovalis on the outside of this cluster of 4, and 2 foramen lacerums on the inside, with the Cela Turcica right in the middle. Okay. And again, here's what our sphenoid bone looks like, better than my little drawing. But what I like about this is it does show you where the Cela Turcica is located right there. And early anatomists thought it resembled a saddle, so that's why they call it the Turk's saddle. Okay, there's the Cela Turcica highlighted right there. And then there's the whole bone itself. So, okay. And again, the sphenoid. The only reason I have this in here is it does show you how the sphenoid butts up against the occipital bone right there. Okay. And the temporal bone. Temporal bone comes in on the sides. Temporal bone fits in on the sides of the occipital bone and also butts up against the sphenoid bone. It's like a giant jigsaw puzzle, if you will. Now, why am I talking about the temporal bone here? Because there's another structure inside the base of the skull that we want to see. Okay, temporal bone again. Now, if we're looking at the skull, we can obviously see we can see the sphenoid bone. See the sphenoid bone up here. There's the sphenoid bone there, and right along in here. Here's the occipital bone here, butting up against it. This is occipital. Here are the temporal bones, here and here, temporal bones. But we have some unique structures that show up here. We have a ridge line here and here. That ridge line extends from the inner ear to this opening right here and right here. The auditory nerve comes in from the inner ear through that opening so it comes out through that opening right there, so it can go into the brain. So, again, we're starting to see how the puzzle pieces all fit together here now. So let me clear away my doodles. And again, it didn't. All drawings. There we go. Now, okay. Jugular foramen for perspective. Now, this other opening here, this is a very important opening. It looks like a tiny little hole, and it is. It's called the hypoglossal canal. The hypoglossal nerve is one of the 12 cranial nerves. However, the hypoglossal nerve is what controls our ability to swallow and manipulate our mouth to speak. Without the hypoglossal nerve, we can't chew, we can't swallow, and we can't speak. And the hypoglossal nerve comes down out of the brainstem from a structure known as the medulla oblongata, passes through the hypoglossal canal and goes into our mouth and controls the muscles of our tongue and the muscles of chewing and swallowing. So we have a hypoglossal canal on each side. And so we have signals going to and from the brain through the hypoglossal nerves on either side here. An individual who's had a stroke and can't swallow likely has had damage in the brainstem, because that's where the swallowing controls are located. You know, the inability to move the mouth, to swallow properly, to eat, to drink, all of that is controlled in the brainstem. And if your patient is exhibiting those symptoms where they can't swallow or chew or eat or anything, it likely indicates there's probably damage in the brainstem. So that's the hypoglossal canal. It's on either side of the foramen magnum. Let me get back. Foramen magnum is right here in the middle. You know, just below and to on the medial surface from the jugular foramen. So there's the hypoglossal canal. Now, we're going to change the angle on this a little bit in this next picture, but we're going to focus on this ridge line here and this opening here and over here. So we are zoomed in a little bit on that portion of the temporal bone, and we're tilted at a slight angle, so we no longer see the foramen ovale, lascerum ovale. They are down below this ridge line, so we're sort of tilting our skull forward. But what we do see, you know, for reference, there's our jugular foramen, there's our hypoglossal canal, there's our foramen magnum. But now we can see the opening of the optic foramen, where the optic nerve comes into the brain from the optic, from the eyeball itself. The optic nerve is passing through that foramen here and over here. We also see another foramen called the foramen rotundum on each side. And that, again, is a passage for one of the cranial nerves. Now, this is the opening that allows the auditory nerve to come into the brain. This is called the internal acoustic or auditory meatus. The auditory nerve carrying sound has passed through this ridge line of bone here. And this is the temporal bone here and here, where the green arrows are pointing. That's all part of the temporal bone. And that ridge line is called the petrous portion of the temporal bone. And so it protects the auditory nerve until it comes out through this opening here. And if we have an internal acoustic or auditory meatus, we're going to have an external. And that external is right at the opening in the temporal bone on the outside of the skull, where we connect to the external ear. So, and again, you can see down here at 68 is the hypoglossal canal. This large opening here is the jugular foramen, and the really large one is the foramen magnum. Okay. So that's how the base of the skull fits together with the sphenoid bone, the temporal bones, and the occipital bone, and all the associated openings and foramens there. Now, I didn't forget about the ethmoid bone. The ethmoid bone sits at the bottom of the cranial cavity, directly above the nasal cavity. In fact, the top of the nasal cavity forms the top, the ethmoid bone forms the very top of the nasal cavity and extends up into the bottom of the cranial cavity. The ethmoid bone is perforated. It has little tiny holes in it. And so the olfactory nerves, which are extending from the nasal cavity, because we have our olfactory receptors, the receptors that let us pick up chemical odors, are found at the top portion of our nasal cavity. And the nerves coming off them pass through the ethmoid bone and enter the brain through a structure known as the cribriform plate. It's perforated. If you look very carefully, you can see little tiny holes in this cribriform plate because we have branches of the olfactory nerve, the smelling nerve, if you will, passing through there, going into the brain. And so this is how we get the olfactory nerve to bring the signals of odors up into the brain through these perforations in the cribriform plate. So now we know that the ethmoid bone extends from side to side on either side of the nasal cavity, extends up into the cranial cavity, into the cribriform plate, and then there's another structure on top of that. The ethmoid bone's not done yet. The ethmoid bone terminates in a structure known as the Crista Galli. The Crista Galli is a place where we anchor the brain to the skull. The brain sits inside of 3 layers of connective tissue known as meninges. The brain itself is too soft and squishy to support its own weight. It would collapse. So the brain has to float inside a sac full of saltwater fluid called cerebrospinal fluid. It's the same fluid that circulates around the brain and down the spinal cord and back up again. It moves around constantly. It's essentially salt water with, proteins and stuff like that in there. Anyway, it's buoyant. It allows the brain to float. So the brain's inside this sac of tissues, but to keep it from sliding all over the place inside the skull, even though it's a snug fit, the meninges anchor onto the Crista Galli. So they hold the brain in place so it doesn't move around too much. I mean, it'll still move, a powerful blow on one side of the skull will cause the brain to bounce over to the other side and bounce back, and with all sorts of, associated damages there. But we normally, the normal everyday activities of the brain, of moving our head around, the brain doesn't get a chance to slosh too much because the meninges are anchored to the Crista Galli. And that sits directly above the cribriform plate. And here we see it. There is the cribriform plate in green, and we have the olfactory nerves coming off of that. The branches of the olfactory nerve come up through the openings and form the large nerves themselves, and then that leads to the region of the brain that processes odors. And here we see where that would be. This area right here labeled 59 is the cribriform plate, and 58 is the Crista Galli. So we see Crista Galli, and then the rest of this here, all the little openings there, is the cribriform plate right there. And so this is all olfactory. Olfactory nerves come up through, branches of the olfactory nerve come up through those openings there, and the Crista Galli anchors the meninges. So the brain can't move around too awful much. And so they work together to hold the brain in place and also to provide us with the passageway of odors coming up through thanks to the olfactory branches of the olfactory nerve that all come together to form the very large olfactory nerve leading to our brain. Okay, there's the Crista Galli and the cribriform plate right there. This is all part of the ethmoid bone sticking up into this region here. So it comes in from the sides, goes up, and it will also go down. Okay, now we're looking at the base of the skull, with the Foramen Magnum right in front of us. The large opening right here is the Foramen Magnum. Here is another opening. This is called the Carotid Canal. Just to have a totally different word here, instead of foramen, we're going to call this the Carotid Canal. This is the passageway of the carotid arteries as they travel up to the brain. The carotid arteries are probably the second largest arteries in our bodies, and they provide blood supply to the brain and to the torso, and they come up off the aorta, and there's a left and right carotid artery, and they split and go internal and external, where you can feel a pulse in your neck at what we call the carotid sinus. That's where the arteries split. One goes external, one goes internal, and they're going to pass through the canal to get into the brain. And they are the counterpart to the jugular vein. So most places, the artery and the vein, the artery carries blood to the tissues, the vein brings it back to the heart. In most places, the artery and vein share the same name, like radial artery, radial vein, for example. Here we have jugular vein and carotid artery. They're running side by side. One's taking blood to the brain, one's bringing it back. Totally different names. Anyway, carotid canal is the passage that the carotid arteries take to get to the brain. Here is the mandibular fossa, the flat area. Fossas are flat areas. This is where the mandible articulates against the skull, right here at the mandibular fossa. So it will move so that our lower jaw can move. The end of the mandible will articulate, move against the skull at that fossa. Here is the vomer. The vomer divides the posterior region of the nasal cavity in half. Just like everything else tends to run in pairs, our nasal cavity is divided into a left and right-hand side, and the vomer separates the nasal cavity into a left and right side in the posterior end of the nasal cavity. In the front, it's going to be the ethmoid bone. But here we see the vomer right there. And directly in front of the vomer, we see a bone called the, the palatine bone. Now the palatine bone leads to the roof of our mouth. The roof of our mouth, it separates the nasal cavity from the oral cavity. It's made up of what we call the hard palate. Words probably derived from palatine. Palatine bone forms the basic structure of the hard palate. It isn't all of it, but it starts it, because this next structure right here is the palatine process of the maxilla. That's the hard palate. That's the roof of our mouth. When you stick your finger in your mouth and push upwards on that hard surface, you're pressing up against the palatine process of the maxilla. Now, this is derived from the palatine bone, which is directly behind it. And then you have your vomer right here. There's your vomer. Okay. And again, Foramen Magnum, Styloid Process, Mastoid Process. Now here's something new term also, condyle, occipital condyle. A condyle is a process that essentially goes up and down. The occipital condyles are bulges in the base of the occipital bone there that allows the skull to sit on top of the first cervical vertebrae, so that our skull can sit on top of our neck. And those two large processes there, these condyles, these are large bulges that essentially extend up and down, allow the skull to balance on cervical vertebrae number 1. In fact, cervical vertebrae number 1, we'll see next week, is called the Atlas, because Atlas was a mythical creature that supposedly carried the world on his shoulders. Well, the occipital condyles rest on top of the Atlas. So we'll see the occipital condyles setting on top of the we'll see the occipital condyle setting on top of cervical vertebrae number 1 next time. Now, so there's the occipital condyles. Whenever we have condyles, they're either going to be condyles where they bulge up and down, or they're going to be called epicondyles that go from side to side. Okay. And one more foramen to throw in here. This is called the stylomastoid foramen. It is an opening between the styloid process and the mastoid process. Okay, now, the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid is there in the front. So the ethmoid goes all the way across from eye orbit to eye orbit, extends out into the front to divide the nasal cavity in half in the front portion, and it extends upward to form the Crista Galli, so that we can have we can attach the meninges to the Crista Galli to hold the brain in place, and the cribriform plate forms the passageway for olfactory nerve branches. So the ethmoid bone's doing a lot of work for us here. This structure here called the glabella. The glabella is all that's left of 2 separate frontal bones. We only have 1 frontal bone, but when we were developing in utero, the frontal bones were formed from membranes, and there were 2 of them, 1 for each side. Those membranes eventually fused together and formed 1 large bone. When we were in utero, we had 2 membranes and we had a suture line in between there. All that's left of that suture line is just a trace of the structure growing together, and we call that the glabella. So it's directly above the nasal bone. That's all that's there. So, okay. There is, I mentioned if we have an external, we have to have an internal, we have to have an internal. If we have an internal, we have to have an external. This is the external acoustic or auditory meatus. This is the opening for the auditory nerve to go in from the inner ear down the petrous process of the temporal bone and come out through the internal auditory or acoustic meatus, so that it can go into the brain with bringing along, sound. Okay, now let's see. Okay, here we go. Let's take a look at this. This is the fetal skull. Now, this is the fetal skull. When we are developing in utero, we have a skeleton in place 6 weeks after conception. 6 weeks after conception, we have a complete skeleton in place. It's all made of cartilage, except for the skull, which is made of membranes, but we're going to use that as the model to lay down bone. And over the next 20 years, we will eventually fill out our whole skeleton from cartilage and membranes to complete bone. And we can see part of that's already accomplished here, looking at the fetal skull. We have a frontal suture that we don't have as adults. That closes. The membranes calcify and become bone. All that we have left is a glabella. But when we are in utero, we have 2 distinct frontal bones separated by a frontal suture. That eventually closes and forms 1 large bone. Why do we have that? For growth of the brain. Our head at birth, our head is disproportionate to the size of the rest of our body because we have a large brain, and our brain continues to get bigger and bigger and bigger over time until we reach our adult stature. And our skull has to accommodate that by being flexible. And that flexibility includes suture lines that have not closed yet, but will eventually close. It will also include what we call soft spots. This is one of the big soft spots. This is called the anterior fontanelle. It's a large area of membranous tissue that hasn't calcified yet, and it won't for quite a while. We don't have a complete skeleton in place until we're about 23 years of age. So this is a soft spot that allows flexibility during delivery. It also allows flexibility as our brain continues to get larger and larger as we grow. And this soft spot goes away eventually, but not right away. So the anterior fontanelle, something else, if you have an anterior, you got to have a posterior. And so we do. There we have the frontal bones. Now we only have a frontal bone. And there are the parietal bones. They stayed as two separate bones. In fact, everything else did except for the frontal bone. Here we see the fetal skull from the side. Parietal bone, frontal bone, temporal bone, coronal suture. The coronal suture stayed. But now we see another fontanelle. That's the sphenoidal fontanelle, right by the sphenoid bone. That's an area of flexibility and give, so that the skull can get bigger. We have another one back here near the mastoid process called the mastoid fontanelle. So these are places where we have give so that we can expand. Again, up there's the very large anterior fontanelle, the very large soft spot. Anterior fontanelle. There's the frontal suture, which doesn't exist anymore in adults. Coronal suture, sagittal suture. They're still there. We look at the posterior surface of the skull. Again, we see the sagittal suture, the two parietal bones, the lambdoid suture, and here we see this tiny little structure is the posterior fontanelle, directly above the occipital bone, which is right there. So the posterior fontanelle is much smaller than the anterior fontanelle, obviously, but these are all going to be areas of extreme flexibility. These are the last areas to calcify in our skull so that we have this range of flexibility we need to allow for our brain to develop. And that is the skull. Anybody have any questions on this? Okay. Next week, I'd like to start looking at the axial skeleton. I will also open up the test. I'll probably give you more than, would you like to have more than just 2 days to work on it? I mean, you're only going to need 45 minutes to take the test, but I can give you a longer window in which you can take the test. Would you prefer more time? I'm seeing an affirmative there. Thank you, Jen. And I would, yes, again, thank you. I will give you more time, and I probably won't open up the lecture test then until the end of the week. We'll get through the, I won't have both exams open for you. I'll give you more time to take the lab test 1. And then after that, we'll open up lecture test 1. I have to finish chapter 2 first though, so which I probably won't get done till Wednesday. So, okay, questions. Do we need to memorize all the bones? Let's see, let me look at the questions here. The lab exam is multiple choice. I've been going back through it and rewriting it so it is not as problematic or complicated as it used to be, and it will all be multiple choice. Hopefully I fixed all the problems with it. Now on the bones, everything that on that list of bones that I think I posted in eLearn, is fair game. If I mention the bone or the opening, it's fair game. Now the way to prepare for this is not to try and start learning a lot of bones at one time. You learn, spend 15 minutes, learn 3 bones, learn 4 bones, learn the bones of the cranium, the frontal bone, the parietal bones, temporal bone, the occipital bones. And then tomorrow, add another bone to that. And the day after that, add another bone to that, until at the end of 3 or 4 weeks, you got everything nailed down. Don't wait to the last minute, because it won't work. I've had people come in and do very poorly on a bone test and say, well, I spent 8 hours studying for this last night. And the night before the bone test, you should probably just be reviewing a few things, because if you're adding a little bit every day, it's not painful. I mean, I've been doing this for a long time, and I know how to tell you to prepare for it. A little bit every day is a whole lot easier to learn the bones than it is to try and do it all at once, because you'll never be able to keep them all straight. And I'll tell you, the reason I can rattle these off is because I've been doing it for 18 years here, and I do it every semester. And gradually it started to sink in, and maybe in a few more years I might have them all learned myself. So, because there are 206 bones, but I said the good news is what's on the left side is the same as the right side, and they count as part of the bones. So don't try and cram everything in. Don't sit down each night and try and study for 2 or 3 hours. 15 minutes. Pick, do a half a dozen bones, and each night add another bone or two to it, and you'll be surprised how well you know it. And yes, also exam 1 is only on unit 1, only in the microscope and the tissues and diffusion and osmosis. Bones are going to be, all the bones will be in the second test. So don't worry about any bones sneaking into test 1. Okay. Any questions? Any more questions? If you have any questions on anything, email me or ask me in class on Wednesday, and I'll be glad to answer you. Otherwise, I'm going to get us out of here, and you'll have a good rest of the day. And I'll see you all later.